Terry, hello.
Hi, Charles. How are you?
I'm doing well. So glad to see you. I'm so glad to welcome our audience tonight to our conversation and our questions and all kinds of different things. I want to say good evening, first of all, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Charles Shepard. I'm the president and CEO of the Fort Wayne Museum of Art. And joining me tonight is Terry Myers. Terry's become a close friend of the museum and a close friend of mine over the past year or two. And his generous donation is highlighted in our Year of Making Meaning exhibition. I want you to know that Terry grew up in Fort Wayne and has worked in the art world for over 30 years as a writer, independent curator, and all of that brought him in close contact with many artists in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. And out of these acquaintances and friendships that blossomed, that allowed Terry to build a stunning collection of art, some of which he's donated in honor of his parents who still live in Fort Wayne. And so tonight we'll talk about Terry's life as a curator, a collector, and his donation to the Fort Wayne Museum of Art. Terry, welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you first to everyone at the museum through this whole process who have been so amazing. This is very special on so many levels. I will say, I feel confident my mother has figured this out on her iPad, and she and my father are here right now with us.
Oh, that's wonderful. Welcome.
On the north side of town. So,
oh, that's super.
Yeah.
I'm glad they're here. I'm totally glad they're here. And I'm glad for all our audience members tonight. Now, Terry, you've had one of the richest life in art of all the folks I've known over my years. And I kind of want to open up by asking you to talk about your varied career, a writer, a curator, a professor, all those things mixed in, which I understand something of, but I think most people think of them independently. Talk about that a little bit if you can.
Oh, absolutely. So one thing I'll say first to sort of toot my own horn, the very well-known art critic, Jerry Saltz, who writes for New York Magazine. Jerry's a friend, and his wife, Roberta Smith, who's the chief curator at the New York Times, has been a friend and a supporter of mine. Jerry once said to me, he's like, "You're the only American art critic who has lived and worked in the three largest cities, New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago." And he might be right. I mean,
I think he is.
It wasn't, none of this was planned this way. Some people, first of all, I'll say there are probably many of the artists who are in this gift that are in this audience right now too. I went to DePaul University in Greencastle, Indiana, and I was, an overachieving kid before that. So I went there on basically a pretty full ride, and I was a studio art major. And then I became a double major and did both art history and studio art. And when I graduated, I moved immediately to New York because I had done my second half of my junior year at DePaul in this great opportunity called the Great Lakes College Association New York Arts Program, which is a consortium of a lot of the smaller liberal arts schools in the Midwest: DePaul, Oberlin, Wabash, Hope, Antioch. I'm not going to remember all of them. And that's when I went. And the great thing about that program is that you did an internship instead of taking classes. You took seminars at night. And I worked for an artist and an art historian who were married. The art historian's name was April Kingsley, who was a major influence on my life. I helped her work on a book she was doing on the Ashcan School. She had started her book on abstract expressionism, and she was married to an artist who I think of as a second and a half generation abstract expressionist painter. So if you think of Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning is first generation. This man's name was Bud Hopkins, and he is the first art that's in the donation came from him. There are 5 pieces of Bud's that I've donated, and everything else sort of came from that. But I moved to New York thinking I was going to wait and try to get an MFA in painting, like a master's in art making.
And Terry, both Bud and April were friends of mine back in the day.
Because of probably Provincetown and, and
Yeah.
also that, yeah. So they were a big, they changed my life. I mean, they, I think Bud and April's daughter may be on this live right now too, Grace.
Wonderful.
I babysat Grace a few times back in those days. And Grace has gone on to be an amazing force for continuing her parents' legacies. So
that's wonderful.
Yeah. I moved there. So I fell into criticism. It was never the plan. I jokingly refer to myself as sort of a runaway from academia. Another very important art critic in New York named John Yao became a friend. He called me up in early summer 1990, and he said, I've been teaching this class for graduate students at Pratt, and I told the chair I don't want to do it anymore, and I told him you're going to do it. And that's how I started teaching. So
wonderful.
I'm very fortunate. I mean, I've worked very hard, I will say, and I've taken chances, but so the other thing I always told my students is I would tell my stories because they're always curious, because most of my teaching has been on the studio side of curriculums, less on the academic side. They're always curious about my pathway because I'm unusual in my pathway. And I'm like, back then it seemed so traumatic. Oh, I'm not going to make art anymore. Oh no. Now I look back and see it all as a really sort of straight line, that like where I was headed was where I was headed. Even from my childhood in Fort Wayne, where I was headed was where I was headed. So,
well, and Terry, I have to insert this as a question, is that I see, and I hope you do see, such a strength as coming from the studio background and getting into the curatorial and art historical background, because you actually understand more than the traditional art historian.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, at SAIC, when I became the chair of the painting and drawing department, which is, that department is larger than most art schools in the United States. I had 1,200 undergrads in painting and drawing, 55 graduate students, 17 full-time faculty, 75 to 80 part-time faculty just in the painting and drawing department when I was chair. I mean, it's a beast. And we would sit on critique panels, and I would occasionally completely floor a student. I remember a student just looking at me I was like, yeah, if someone forced me to, I could probably still put down an oil ground, Then I had these, I had these hands on. But what I want to say very specifically, I think it's in the slideshow that we're going to look at later, but the first artwork that I acquired that's in the gift is a cut paper collage from Bud of one of his Guardian paintings. It's the one that's in the slideshow, so we'll look at it later. Those paintings were done on wood-shaped panels that he had fabricated for him. He used to call them his chassis. And one of my jobs in the studio was to prepare the ground on those panels and to do the preliminary schematic drawing for that Guardian. So that's why he gave me that collage study, because I did the preliminary drawing so he could then paint the painting. I think that piece is the second one, the other one from that series that I also gave you, same story. I did the drawing, he made the painting after I did all the preliminary work for him in the studio. So, and because I did go to graduate school for a hot minute in New York, but it all unraveled because the faculty all left to go other places. I was in the graduate program at the City University of New York when very high-powered art historians were teaching there, like Linda Docklin. Rosalind Krauss was a teacher of mine, Robert Pincus Witten, who became a mentor. And I started writing. I sent something to a critic named Barry Schwabsky, who was the new editor of Arts Magazine, which was a magazine that had been founded in 1902. So it had been around a long time. Barry called me up and said, I really like this, but I didn't know I was getting it, of course, so I can't run it for a few months. And would you like to do more? That's how I started. I didn't know anybody. I did have this great job. I had this $18,000 a year, I think, job in the library at the Museum of Modern Art. That was my 9-to-5 job. So it was like, it was a charmed life. Now, for the younger former students of mine or whatever, maybe in the audience, my share of the rent in New York City in 1987 when I moved there was $235.
Oh my!
So it's a very different world.
Oh, very different world.
Yeah.
But a wonderful world.
Yeah. I mean, look, I got my education. I tell people as cliches, I got my education on the streets of Soho in the late 80s and in artist studios. And Bud and April were key to that, because I think one of the things that grounded me, and this I think relates to what you're trying to do at the museum, is because of the two of them, I met artists that had at that point in the 80s, had 30-year careers already. They were not household names, but they had managed to continue to make their work. They were in some museum collections. They had some, they were known in the artist community, but they weren't, the superstars. They weren't. And I always am grateful for having maybe a more nuanced relationship to this thing called the art world. And that I think there's amazing art being made in all different situations. And I refuse both extremes. Like, I never wanted to be the critic that was always chasing after just like the hot names, and there are people who do that.
Yeah.
I won't name any names. But on the other hand, I didn't want to be one of these like armchair Marxist academic types that just would dismiss out of hand an artist because they had a market or a career. There are amazing artists who have markets and careers and have become major that are important as well. So I never liked either sort of extreme position I've done so many. I worked for Roy Lichtenstein for a few years. That's another thing I did for, working for him was amazing. Here's a national treasure, the most humble guy. I think that I am a product of the conglomeration of experiences I've had across the spectrum of what we could think of as the contemporary art world.
Well, and one of the things that I got excited about as soon as we got to know each other is that we sort of both came up in the art world in New York in the same time period. I was coming out of grad school. I was curating for Williams College Museum of Art, Tom Krenz.
Mm-hmm.
And in the same way that you're saying, I got to meet people that were great artists that had been, nicking away at everything and making a living, but they weren't household names. Marsha Hafif, a lot of different, Joseph Marioni, a lot of people that were wonderful, sweet people. And I think we've both wondered, you and I both, like, I wonder when they're going to get discovered, but they're really great.
Well, yes, we obviously share that. And having known you, full disclosure, there was a moment when Charles and I were in discussion about maybe doing a project that didn't come together for a variety of reasons. When you were at your prior institution.
That's right.
But my curating, look, I worked at the Museum of Modern Art. I was very fortunate. I was useful in the library to people. So I ended up having these special experiences there too. The great curator, Kiniston McShine, who was such a force there starting in the 70s. When I was there in the late 80s, his apartment caught on fire and he lost almost everything. It was when he was working on his big Andy Warhol retrospective. So I came in on the weekends and got paid extra to help him. And so the first MoMA catalog that has my name in the laundry list of acknowledgements at the back is the 1989 Warhol retrospective. But Kiniston, again, was a force. And again, all this sort of web in the early 70s, April Kingsley was Kiniston's curatorial assistant at the Museum of Modern Art when he did a very important show called Information, which was a kind of very early conceptual art show that's been a legendary show. So, and Bill Rubin, who was the Picasso scholar, the force of the painting and sculpture department at MoMA, did a Picasso Brock show when I was there. And I got tasked with helping his assistant find all these obscure early 20th century French publications through interlibrary loan. So I'm in acknowledgments of that book too. Like, so it was an amazing place to be. And of course it's the freaking Museum of Modern Art, you know, it's church. It's for people like us, it's church.
You had a dream career, Terry.
Yeah. And I just want to say my curating one thing I've learned being at MoMA early on is that I knew I wasn't cut out for an institutional curatorial job. I wasn't cut out for it. My curating has sort of been on two tracks. One track I've done these group shows of like 8 or 9 people. There are artists, I'm sure, in the audience right now who've been in these shows I've done for commercial galleries over the years. And they tend to be, I get these images in my head of artists, their work, and then I do the show to figure out what it means. I often decry what I call the dog in art approach to art, to curating, when a curator wakes up in the middle of the night and they have this idea, dog.
Yeah,
and then they run around looking for anything that's got dog, and they put it all together and they think they've curated a show. I'm like, well, I don't think you actually have. So with those commercial shows, I've been able, because dealers are willing to, they ask me to do them, or they're willing to let me say, well, I'm doing the show to figure it out. Like the show's the start, not the end. So there's that half. The other half is I've done these for museums, these guest appearances doing serious monographic surveys on artists that I feel have been overlooked. The most recent one I did is an artist, Candida Alvarez, who is in the Gift, an amazing artist who I met through a colleague at the School of the Art Institute. And I did her first survey exhibition of 40 years of her work at Chicago Cultural Center. And a lot has happened since. I did the first survey co-curating with Connie Butler, who's now the chief curator at the Hammer Museum out here in LA, of Kay Rosen, who's an artist who lives in Gary, Indiana, but internationally shown, who's also in the Gift now because
wonderful artist.
So those shows, so I just want, this painting behind me is a work by an artist named Linda Daniels. And you, as we were talking before we started, there's a gouache of hers in this year's donation, and there's a small painting coming next year from 2002. This is a recent work of hers. Linda's on my short list of that survey treatment at some point. She's of a certain age, let's say. I've known her for 30 years. I met her in 1988. I've had an ongoing dialogue with her about her work, and I'm going to do that show somewhere someday. It's going to happen.
It's a great way to look at it. It really is. And your approach to, first of all, your understanding of how you want to curate, and then your ability to move within that space so that you have the flexibility to curate in the manner you want to, I think is what gives your career such integrity.
Well, thank you. I mean, we all find different ways of doing things. And the other thing I like to say though about the art world is, none of us have clean hands. That the art world can be a sort of dirty business like any business, and but in the end, what I'm most proud of with the curating especially, but the writing too, is when people have said to me, you showed me something I didn't know I wanted to see. Like that kind of attitude of like, that I remember being at a curatorial conference in Philadelphia. Maybe you were there, Charles, in the early 2000s. Dave Hickey was the head speaker.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
Everybody was there from the Tate in London. And Dave Hickey was up there saying, the only 2 artists worth doing shows are Ed Ruscha and Bruce Nauman. And while this was happening, I had a show out here up at the Hammer of an artist named Robert Overby, who had died before his work was known. and it was getting a lot of buzz. So I'm there as one of the few critics, and all these curators are coming up to me, including a couple who had turned down the show Traveling, saying like, "Oh, we should have taken that show." And I'm like, "I told you." I said,
Yeah,
"I told you."
I told you.
So, you know, I don't ascribe to that. And that was one of the things about institutional curating that I felt would be a concern. The moment where I would feel pressure to sort of do something
or to not do something
that I really wasn't absolutely thrilled about. I mean, I'm very proud about the Kay Rosen retrospective, which was in 1998 here at MoCA in LA. Connie and I did that show, the first big survey of her work, and not a single board member nor the museum owned a Kay Rosen at that point.
Wow.
That's almost unheard of.
That's amazing.
So, you know, but I don't want to suggest that I'm just like trying to you know, I just want to do good work. And, you know, I understand why we all have motivations and we all do things for different reasons. And, you know, being a critic, I've learned there are also people who, you know, I have my own list of enemies too. I just want to tell a quick story quickly.
Yeah,
one of the proudest moments when I first started writing in the early days in New York, I was living in the Lower East Side, pre-cell phones, you know, I had an answering machine with, I think, a cassette tape to record the messages.
Sure.
But I happened to, no caller ID, none of that existed. And I picked up my phone and someone said, "Is this Terry Myers?" And now I'm not going to say it fully, but they were like, "F you," and they hung up the phone. And I remember like bragging to everyone that whole weekend, being out at shows. I'm like, "Oh my God, I got the most amazing phone call over the weekend."
Somebody really paid attention here.
So, yeah. You want a reaction. You know, like you feel like you're doing your work so people can see it, read it, whatever. You want a reaction. You know.
Well, and Terry, a thing that you and I both share is kind of a sense of surprise, amazement, and celebration about the fact that so many good, maybe even really great artists passed from favor, and they had favor at one point, and the next thing you know, they didn't have favor, and they kind of go under the radar screen.
Yeah.
And I think you love those people, as I do, and you've been smart enough to collect many of these.
Well, again, smart is a relative term. Again, one of the reasons that this idea had been in my head for a while, especially after, as some people will know, I gave my papers, my 40 boxes left my place in Chicago before I moved back to LA. And out of that, about 10 boxes of my actual, what are my papers, are now in the library at the museum, at the Art Institute of Chicago, not the school, but at the museum, which is very special for me. So when that happened, it sort of, you know, and again, we haven't gotten there yet, but maybe this is a segue to why this museum, yes, I'm from Fort Wayne and it's important just by default because of that, but it's more than that, of why this was an idea. But what I want to say is the overwhelming majority of what I've given this year and what's coming next year had been given to me, you know, and I'm one of those people that sort of sees art is longer than any of us, and that you're just sort of temporary caretakers of it, you know, that you're
so like, true.
You know, you know, I'm not saying I've never bought artworks. In my limited budget, I have bought things, and there are some things that I've passed on. But the generosity of artists, or the dialogue of artists, is what really fueled this. And it just never would have crossed, it just made sense. I think I've always sort of knew that this kind of thing would happen, because I wanted the stuff to stay together. As I was saying to you before we started, there are a lot of artists in this donation, in this collection, that know each other for even longer than I've known them. I've met one through another. There's a real web. Not everybody. Like, I'm not saying that there are outliers for sure, but there's a real story that maybe I'm the pass through with all these different individuals. So the idea of it all coming together, everything's relatively small. I had this thought, maybe in 20 years, another curator at the museum will be like, we could just put it all up on one wall, like salon style, just like the whole thing, and sort of take it on as a what the hell is this, or what is this about? So, and the museum has expanded. I have been paying attention. Your arrival was noted by me. I'm like, I know that guy. But also that it was, I don't know if you want me to go into my history,
I do,
what's next,
because what I want everybody to know tonight as we proceed is that you've given this amazing collection of yours to the Fort Wayne Museum of Art. It's high caliber, wonderful museum quality art. You've chosen to give it here. That your tie is that you grew up here, but also your tie is to, I hope, what will and trust that we'll do with it. So yeah, launch on, Terry.
Okay, well,
it's wonderful.
Starting with the present, noting that, for example, you started this Prints and Drawings Study Center, that was, and the majority of what I'm giving, now there are paintings, a few paintings coming in 2021, but majority is drawings or prints or, works on paper. That everything well, a couple of things. I often tell students that, there's this myth of again, Jerry Salt said to his great line about there's nothing more pathetic than an art critic at an art fair, a commercial fair. This idea that criticism had been diminished, which I think that argument can be made in many ways. But I impressed on students so much and artists that, you got to get things that you got to get a bibliography. You got to get your work written about. I think the bibliographies are often the thing that helps something get excavated out of the storage of an institution, the paper trail. And I'm convinced there's so much hot art that's been collected that's in museums, and it may be up on the walls now, but the moment it goes in storage, it may never be seen from again. So, I thought I did give a few smaller things that weren't, I shouldn't say this, but I'm going to, as meaningful maybe to the Art Institute. Mark Pascal, who's the great curator of prints and drawings there, is amazing. I think he's a little disappointed, because he came to my place in Chicago and, maybe he wanted to cherry pick, we didn't get to that point. I'm not sure if that's the case, but the Art Institute is a behemoth. It's and I just thought, well, they barely even have any space for a permanent installation of work from their prints and drawings collection. And this museum, again, I was born in Fort Wayne, grew up till halfway through my 6th grade year on the sort of near south side, just maybe not that far north of Lutheran Hospital, the original Lutheran Hospital. Then we moved in the middle of my 6th grade year to the north side, up near Northrop, which is where I went to high school. That's where my parents still live. But I'm gonna have to ask my mother. I deliberately didn't ask her now if she can remember. I know that I went to the museum when it was in the mansion, before it moved in the 80s. I know I went. I'm for children's things, or I have memories of going in that space. So it was a formative thing. Then I went to college, and around the time I went to college is when the museum opened the building that it's now in its expanded version. And I can remember going to the museum, and I'm learning more about this thing called contemporary art. And the very specific moment was seeing the Larry Rivers painting that you guys have, the very important from 1951 early Larry Rivers, called The Burial, which is, for those of you who aren't familiar, it's his
great painting.
Yeah, it's a major work. It is his version of a very famous painting by the French 19th century painter Gustave Courbet. And Rivers, that was the way I went to the Allen County Public Library, and I got Sam Hunter, who was a very important art historian from that time, wrote a big coffee table book on Larry Rivers, got that book, and learned about Rivers, and then by extension, the New York School, all those artists from the 50s, really from the 1940s on. And I also learned about the curator and poet Frank O'Hara. And Frank, because of his relationship with Rivers, and Frank O'Hara became like my hero in a way. With that more solidified once I got to New York. But that painting being in the museum was key. And the other thing about that painting is I distinctly remember being confused and trying to figure out why it had Gloria Vanderbilt's name on the wall label. Because it was given to the museum by, I think, something called the Gloria Vanderbilt Fund or something like that.
Yes, it was.
And, here, this is this famous sort of celebrity type person. I knew nothing about that world, of course. And that's when I started, people give things to museums, how this all works, how it was the first sort of moment of even recognizing that. But Charles just walked off into the garden of the castle that he's.
Yeah, I'm back in the castle.
so and the other thing about Fort Wayne, of course, is it was early on, high school, I think, is when I learned about an artist named Bruce Nauman. Is one of the most important artists of the 20th century, who was born in Fort Wayne. And knowing that was like, oh, okay.
This can
he
work.
was born here. Yeah. And then like David Smith, the very important, was born in Decatur, which at this point is almost a kind of suburb of Fort Wayne. So there is this, and there are a lot of artists from Indiana, actually. The Indianapolis Museum, when Holly Day, who had been their curator for 30 some years, retired, did a show called Crossroads of American Sculpture. And it was David Smith, Bruce Nauman, William Wiley, George Rickey, Robert Indiana, John Chamberlain, and all of those artists were born in Indiana. And that was kind of amazing to me, because that's a pretty decent mini survey of American sculpture. And they all came from the Hoosier State.
Yeah, it's amazing.
So, Fort Wayne, and my father is from there too. My mother came from Michigan. So my grandmother worked at, Charles, you may not know this history, but she worked when I was a kid at Wolf and Dessauer's, which was the department store downtown that became L.S. Ayres.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what it is now, but it's walkable from the museum. My mother worked my mother, when I was a kid, worked for a print shop near the Allen County Public Library. I remember going there when I was a child. And then her last job before she retired was for the state of Indiana, the unemployment office, workforce, or whatever it's called. And my father was a metal lathe operator at Zollner Pistons.
Wonderful.
And I always, the Detroit Pistons exist because they used to be the Zollner Piston basketball team. So in Fort Wayne it drove me nuts in many ways. It still does, but its history is interesting and provocative. I'm just going to be very cryptic here. I told Charles about an idea relative to another collection of mine that's coming that I'm not sure we're going to talk about or not. But this idea of highlights of Fort Wayne's history being produced as sort of souvenirs. So I really want to figure this out, Charles. So
I would too.
I just say I'm giving the museum also. I got obsessed with a certain category of Japanese toys, and when I learned the museum was entering into that toy, which has been a pet project of yours, it seems, for a while.
It has. I
was like, oh my God, it's like Hollywood wrote this story, about what's happened.
It's so true.
So anyway, we have images to look at now. I'm hoping to get there to see this up before it comes down. So,
let me tell you, Terry, it's beautiful. It's beautiful.
And I think I did the count. Maybe there are about 40 works that are up in the room.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
The count for 2020 is 59. And then I think there are 10 coming next year, and then that many small paintings too. But you already have the 10. For those of you who are, I divided the gift, so some of it happens this year and some of it happens next year.
And we are so thankful, Terry. We love it. It's so beautiful.
Well, I have to say, when I was first sent these images, I was like, wow, it's kind of amazing, because in my place in Chicago, most of this was just like literally in the long hallway I had, floor to ceiling, just like, yeah, because so to see it actually, and to see the relationships, what you guys did, curatorially, is really great. And I don't know, I think that it becomes, to me, it becomes greater than the sum of its parts in a way, from what I can tell. Like, I think it just reinforces my desire. So if in that one, the left side of the wall, the left wall, the work in the middle, there's a work on that's the cut paper Guardian study from the first, the first artwork from this donation that I would have acquired. And then the one to the right of it is another Guardian study. We have to, Grace Hopkins, if you're on this call right now, we have to get that Guardian's number, the one in the middle, its number right, because I got the yellow one figured out, but I can't remember which Guardian that study is from.
I hope she's here.
Yeah, I think she is, but anyway, I gave your curator, everyone, they have everyone's contact info, and there are 3 artists who have passed from the collection. 2 who passed, after having a long, lengthy life, and another artist, a painting you're going to get next year of an artist who's my age, who died unexpectedly about a year ago. But everyone else is working away.
Well, and the exciting thing about being able to reach out to those artists that are still working away is any bits of information and stories that they can share. That's what we use to engage people all the time who, want to know the kind of behind the scenes stuff, and are so excited about you as someone who came from here and has gone on to do all that you've done and amass this collection.
Right.
And
sorry, my Facebook just went. I just had the Facebook over here on the side,
there you
I
go.
just got
That's
it.
all right.
And again, I take an artist like Kay Rosen, who was just in the last slide, who has had her international career living and working in Gary. And I don't know if you guys know this. Kay was in an early group show that a curator named Peter Frank organized for the museum at the Fort Wayne Museum. So she was extra thrilled about the Fort Wayne Museum, and so I feel like there's a core group of artists in this collection that are pretty nearby, and I guess part of my hopeful sort of backseat driving with this too was to sort of inspire. Like, I met Lauren Wolfer, who's your young, really liked her and her vibe, and I thought, well, these are artists that are worth knowing about, and who knows what can happen, because I've appreciated reading about how you see the mission of the museum in terms of how it works with, current artists and American artists in particular. And it just dovetails nicely, I think, with a lot of my thinking at this point.
Well, a thing that you and I, have in commentary is that let's go back to the 80s. You could go back to the 70s or the 60s, but let's just go back to the 80s. And at that time, you could see so many people, so many artists who were just knocking it out of the park. And, like other decades, 10, 20 years later, you wonder, are they still knocking it out of the park? They're still great. Who's paying attention? It's like Art World, where you're listening. And I love to bring forth people that, you recognize and I recognize, having had so much talent, let's make sure people know about them, and let's celebrate and champion their work.
Right. No, and I'm going to toot my own horn for a second. I think I have worked really hard to have an eye and to make choices, to make judgments. When I got tenure at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, the head of the tenure board, again, I was this critic curator in the painting and drawing department. And it was confusing, I think, for the academics in art history. And with the head of the tenure board was, I really like this guy. He's a professor of philosophy. And he said to me, well, congratulations, because, subjectivity is coming back. And I said, oh, well, I never left it.
There you go.
Like I never, we all have subjectivity, just in art discourse, it's really hidden a lot, and people work very hard to cover their tracks, and that's not me. I feel like, I've written my fair share of very critical reviews. Another thing I want to say at this point, and this is probably be boring to several people on the talk right now, is that, well, I'll just say it as an anecdote. When Candida Alvarez and I did the show at the Cultural Center, we did a talk the day of the opening in the auditorium at the Cultural Center. And those of you some of you in Fort Wayne may know, that's the beautiful 19th century building that used to be the public library with the Tiffany ceiling, a great, great location. There were students in the crowd, and a student asked Candida, because I wasn't really talking, we weren't going into like identity politics, and we weren't really like going into a lot of things that in art school have really kind of taken over in many ways, for good reason. I'm not criticizing that.
Totally understand.
The student asked a question sort of around, like, basically, I'm paraphrasing here, like, he's not really talking about you. And Kenny's response was, thank you. And the student was really taken aback. But my point is that I'm really committed to the idea. Well, then I said, well, I have to be clear here. Candida's become a friend, she's an amazing person, but I did not do this show for her. I did it for her work, that I am here working for the work. That the work is not the artist, no matter how biographical it is, no matter how the work goes out. And funnily enough, it has lives of its own. All these crazy things happen to it.
That's so true.
If you think you can control it, Well, oh my God, this is a perfect segue. So Carl, if you're on this talk, I still have no idea what the hell was going on in this moment when he made this piece. It just cracks me up. Like, Carl's a very interesting artist, known him again 30 some years, first in New York, and he is married to Linda Daniels, the painter behind me. They've both moved back to the north of Santa Barbara, where Linda is from originally. And there's a second work of Carl's in the donation as well. And he gave me this crazy digital photograph back around 2005. And with Carl, one of the things I appreciate about Carl is that I never really know what to expect in what's going on in his work, but that becomes the sort of thread through his work. I mean, Carl's worked in film in his early days, and again, a very interesting artist. But if you go to the museum and you see this piece next to the piece that's 10 years earlier, I think from 1995, you'd be hard pressed to wrap your head around how this is the same artist. So I was cracking up yesterday when I got the slideshow in advance that this was one of the things you picked, because to be honest with you, I still am not 100% convinced what's going on. So maybe your curators can grill Carl about it at some point.
Well, it caught everybody's attention, and if Carl's out there, we love it. And both Elizabeth and Lauren did a great job in assisting me to put this all together, and it's a showstopper. It really is.
But it's a perfect place to start because, and again, like, you know, at the Art Institute, in my papers, there's a Carl Petronak folder that would have like correspondence, you know, like all my history with him, the things I've written about his work, you know, so there's a bit of a paper trail between me and Carl as well. So,
Well, I think it's great. I think it's great.
likewise, Brent is likely on this call right now too. You have 2 drawings of his. You're going to get a painting next year. Another artist who I met in the early 90s. I put him in a group show in New York. The show got a great review from Roberta Smith, and suddenly then everyone went and saw it. The funny thing about that, she wrote a review of 3 shows, and the Times editors gave her review the overarching headline. It said, "Abstraction, a trend that may be coming back." Which I just thought was so funny.
Oh, that's funny. That's very funny.
But Brent's been around in New York for a long time. He did early on, Brent did a show before I knew him with Leo Castelli Gallery, which is like one of the most important galleries of all time in the art world, I would say.
Of all time.
And an amazing artist, still working, lives in New York. I haven't seen him in person in a while, but we stay in touch. And then writing about Brent, this sort of, you know, so I was the California editor for the New Art Examiner for a while, which was a magazine based in Chicago, which prided itself, and rightly so, as an independent voice. And they used to have this, magazine. Yeah, they used to have this 1-page section called Studio Visit, where you could write, and I wrote a studio visit page about Brent's work for them. So that's where I got to get some words out in print about what I was thinking about with his work. So, and again, this drawing, both drawings and the painting were all generously gifts. I think one of them was for a birthday. I can't remember all the details, but so of course the thought is to pass them on to regift. This is a regift more as much as a donation.
Well, so. It's very generous, Terry, and we certainly love it, we have to tell you. And folks have loved it in the show.
And again, Jill, Jill, who I introduced Jill and Brent to each other. Again, knowing them both, I knew Jill even longer. Jill showed in the same gallery that Linda Daniels showed in back to the late 80s. Big fan of her work. I got my apartment when I moved from Long Island City, Queens to the Lower East Side. It was Jill's former studio because she moved to 14th Street. So I got my place to live thanks to Jill. Thank you, Jill, because again, I'm pretty convinced she's on this right now too. So, but that's, you know, amazing. She's given me a few things. I have a sculpture of hers here in LA that I love. But again, so Jill's a perfect case. Her and Steve Keister, who is also in the donation, they're married, both really important artists. They were both collected by a very famous husband and wife team, Herb and Dorothy Vogel, who maybe some people know about. You know, that he was a postman and she was a librarian, and they amassed this amazing collection. There was a documentary done about them because they gave this massive amount of their collection to the National Gallery. But they also did this 50-state initiative because there was so much art that they identified, and they identified a museum in every state in the United States that each got a selection of work. So there's a website, it's called the 50 by 50 initiative, I think. There's a website that would tell you where Jill's pieces are, where Steve's pieces are. So I guess I felt like, well, with Jill and Steve, it was like knowing that there's an opportunity to see their work in I don't remember which Indiana institution. It might have been the museum at Bloomington at IU. I'm not 100% sure about that.
I think it was, Jerry.
Yeah. But I thought, well, now there'll be some Levines and Keisters in Fort Wayne too.
That's right.
They're in every, that their work, they're not, I want to be clear here. It's not that they're in every 50 state. I forget which states their works went to, but artists from the Vogel collection went to all 50 states.
All over 50 states. Well, you know, Jill, I've been a fan of Jill's work for years.
And I had no idea.
I've never had a piece before, and I'm so delighted that we have it now.
Well, I think the
I'm delighted for her.
sculpture,
I'm delighted for you.
I think the sculpture might have to come your way at some point too, because it's really beautiful. You haven't even seen it yet, but I don't know, Jill, if you're on here, it was a thought I had that ultimately it's a piece called Hound Dog, which I just love.
Well,
And I thought, yeah.
And Jill, if you're on here, please know I'm going to say yes. Oh, tell us about this one, Terry.
Okay, well, this is okay. So this accentuates other things. So Micah and Oliver are a husband and wife duo who live in Berlin, still working. I sort of lost track of them, and actually, this gift, they found out about it and they got back in touch with me. They did a show with a gallery out here in LA, and I met them then, and we just really hit it off. And their dealer said, "Oh, he has something for me." And he gave me this small drawing that they left for me, and I just loved it. And I did go visit them in Berlin, but the way I got to them was through my work as a critic and seeing shows. And so this is a different situation where these aren't people that unlike Jill or Carl or Brent, that I feel are sort of artists I kind of grew up as my career was developing over the decades. I met them, it would have been 98. I think 98 was when they came to LA, had a show here at Mark Fox Gallery. And I loved their work. And I wrote a little thing. I was writing for the LA Weekly at that point. And again, some people may be like, oh, getting gifts from artists, they're buying your favor. They're, like it's a conflict. But because I knew in my head, I always thought that the idea is I was just going to re-get, like, I wasn't going to put, if any of these artists would have taken off, I don't think I would be, it wouldn't have been in my way of thinking to think, oh, I'm going to go sell that or,
Well, exactly.
And none of these are small, these are, and it is a tradition. Again, I think of Frank O'Hara, his influence on me, the art world. I say this to students all the time because they had this very, like my freshmen and sophomores always had this really misguided idea of what a critic was. And I was like, look, even when a critic's being their most critical, they're still more on the side of the artist than anyone else. They're right with the artist, I could, I know that I could have, gone into the commercial gallery world. I've had offers, and maybe I will now. I don't know. I'm not saying that. It's not that I'm immoral, but I'm not against it. I mean, amazing dealers are amazing people, and I have great respect for them. But I just want to disabuse anyone of the notion that I've made massive amount of money from my curating and critic life. It hasn't happened.
No, that's not the way it works.
Our magazines, it's still Flash Art magazine, which exists, is based in Italy, still owes me money from the mid 1990s. When they were paying like $30 a review. So it's not about the money. I didn't laugh all the way in the bank.
Yeah, it's not about the money.
I mean, the teaching did sustain me. The teaching was something that I was able, to be, as I was full professor, I'm very grateful to have had the stability of that job, especially at the School of the Art Institute. The
best place to be in the world.
Yeah. I mean, I missed LA. I've glossed over a lot of things. I left New York in '94 because New York felt really like it felt like things weren't happening. I wasn't allowed to continue teaching at Pratt, which is where I was teaching, because the union there, they had to promote you after 4 years. So, but the financial situation in New York, they couldn't do it. So I had been coming to LA, and I can remember, including some of the artists who maybe have this call, people be like, "Where are you going?" Like when I moved to LA. And of course, I've been a beneficiary of the ascendancy of LA since that time and the powerhouse it's become for contemporary art. So when I took the job at the Art Institute, I kept my place here where I am right now. I knew I was coming back at some point, that LA really became home pretty quickly, which was a shock to me because when I moved from Indiana to New York, I thought, okay, I'm here, never going to leave. I'm going to be one of those New Yorkers,
Yeah. Yeah.
and things change. And I don't regret it. I mean, I love New York, but I'm glad I don't live there. LA became, and of course, having so many young artists and a great, vibrant scene here has been tremendous for me.
It's going to be thrilling, truthfully. Terry, somebody just sent me a question that I want to ask you.
Okay.
As we get to the end of things.
Yeah, because we're getting up against the clock. So yeah.
Well, and before the clock comes, though, I have a question that asks you what you might want to say to younger listeners who may want to become writers or independent curators. Do you have any advice, I guess, is what the question is? Because you've been an inspiration.
Well, I hope so. I will say sometimes I think I have done my duty by talking a young student out of it. I'm not. Well, one of my jokes, it wasn't really a joke, I used to say to the artists, these young artists, and undergrads, is that an art school is a great place to become a lot of different things. I'm like, do you realize how many amazing bands have come out of art schools? Do you realize how many? I said, an art school education can allow you to do a lot of things, and if you happen to come from a lot of money and it doesn't work out to continue making art, become a great collector.
There. Perfect.
So, but what I would say is I'm maybe the last generation, part of a generation of the way I did it isn't so available anymore because things have gotten more institutionalized. There are all these curatorial MA programs and even now criticism MAs and institutions, and none of that existed when I left my art history graduate coursework at CUNY. And I was down, Robert Pincus went and said to me, he's like, you don't want to write the big book report anyway, meaning the dissertation. He's like, you're already downtown. So things have changed now. Everyone now is looking at, where a young person came from in terms of their education beyond their undergrad. I mean, I had the classic liberal arts education at DePaul, very rigorous, it was a very conservative school, which in hindsight was a smart decision for me. I joke with friends. I have a friend who went to Oberlin. I'm like, Oberlin's an amazing school, but had I gone there and just agreed with everyone all the time, I don't know that I would have gotten my chops.
I think that's a very smart observation.
I didn't know that at the time. I'm not saying I don't want to, but I argued with people all the time at DePaul, and very smart people, kids, my generation. So, I mean, I was in this pretentiously titled honor scholar program there. There are people from my class of 15 that are, federal judges now. I mean, these are amazingly impressive people. And, some of them truly old school conservative, and I appreciate our dialogues, so, but what I would say to a young person is there is a sort of institutional thing that I sense now, and even our current situation has maybe sort of broken it up a bit, that maybe there are new pathways again to sort of go back to that, get your friends together. So you have to hang out with artists, no matter where you are. You have to argue with them. You have to try to see everything. And if you're going to write, if you're going to do a blog, try to find someone that can be an editor for you. Because one of my pet peeves about the whole blogification of criticism is that there are a lot of people that just need editors. And again, would often disabuse students of the notion, you all just think I just get to do everything I want. I get turned down more than I get told yes. And when I write something, it goes through editorial, back and forth. And, and a great editor is a godsend, some of the best work I've done, I'm so grateful to the person in that job. And that's harder to find now because there's this assumption almost like the art assumption, like the whole I know what I like, or my kid could do that, all those sort of cliche notions. Everyone's a critic. And yes, it's true. We are all critics. We all make judgments all the time. But the move from that to getting it down on paper, to trying to write and say what you really mean and be clear, doesn't just happen naturally. And I'm very suspicious of people who claim writing's easy. It's been hard for me my whole career. Again, there are people on this call who know that because they've been the beneficiaries of phone calls of like panic moments.
You're so right.
I think that you have to stay on the side of the artist. If you are in those academic programs, I'm not saying be against it but just try to keep it at arm's length as you're learning things in those programs. And spend as much time away and like in your peer group, and in artist studios, and go towards the things that you think you can't stand, like go towards things that just like bug you.
Sure, test
again,
yourself.
Another thing that always bugs students when I would do critiques with undergrads is I would say, I'm going to really resist trying to tell you whether I like something or not. You shouldn't be that concerned if I like it or not. You should be concerned with whether I think it's any good or not. And I don't mean that in sort of reaffirming like old, tired, oppressive notions of quality and the way it was used to like exclude people. But I do think, we all make decisions about what's good and bad every second of our waking lives. If we didn't, we couldn't function. We have to so to just constantly, like, there's artwork that I would say I hate, but it's amazing and important and powerful, and vice versa. There's artwork I love, but I don't necessarily think it's that good, which sounds like a contradiction, but to me it's not.
Totally understand what you're saying. Terry, I want to thank you so much for having this conversation this evening and sharing your perspectives, which I find just wonderful, with all our audiences. I want to thank our audiences for being here. I want to thank all the team that made this happen. Thank you all. Have a great holiday, and I wish you well tonight. Terry, good night.
Great. Thank you, Charles. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to everyone who's in the audience. I think I'm going to be here. I just got a text from one of you. I think I'm going to be hearing from people. All right. Have a good night. Thanks so much, Charles. And to be continued. Watch this space.
Yeah, to be continued.
Okay. Bye. Bye.